I love cardigans, always have, so this pattern was a joyful project for me. It's Simplicity 9272, a classic knit cardigan with a top-stitched facing and a button front. For all of my main seams, I've used a narrow zigzag stitch with a width of 0.5 and a length of 2.5. For my facing top stitching, I just used a regular straight stitch. And for my hems, I used a zigzag stitch with a width and length of 3 millimeters. This brushed knit is super soft and stretchy, a perfect choice for this piece. Let's sew it now. Here is the wrong side of my back bodice piece, and I've applied knit stay tape to the shoulder seams to prevent overstretching over time. I'll turn it to the right side. And after applying knit stay tape to the shoulder seams of the front pieces as well, I'll place them right sides together with the back piece. Pin and sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Press your seams open. I've applied interfacing to the wrong side of each of my facing pieces. Now I'll place them right sides together and pin the shoulder seams. Then I'll sew those shoulder seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Finish the entire outer edges of the facing. You can use your serger, a zigzag stitch, or you can fold those raw edges to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch and zigzag or stitch in place. Place your facing right sides together with the neckline and pin in place all the way around the inner edges. Then we'll sew as pinned with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. To reduce bulk in these seams, I'm going to trim the interfaced portion only all the way around. I'll also clip the inner corners. Then we're going to understitch the facing. We're going to turn the facing over its seam allowance and stitch the facing to the seam allowance all the way around. As you make your way to the 2 top corners, your presser foot won't be able to understitch all the way to the corner, so understitch as far as you can, backstitch to secure, and start again on the other side of the point, stitching on the facing side close to the seam all the way around. Turn your facings entirely to the inside along the seam line. Give the center fronts and the neckline a good press. Then along the neck edge, we're going to sew the facing to the bodice from center front all the way around to the opposite center front with a 1 inch seam allowance. Now that I've finished the neck edge, I've gone ahead and pinned my facings to the center fronts. We're going to baste the facing in place once again with a 1 inch seam allowance from the top, stopping our basting 5 inches before the bottom raw edge. Place your front and back pieces right sides together and pin the side seams. Sew both side seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Fold Fold your sleeve in half right sides together and pin the underarm seam. Sew the underarm with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seam open. I've also gone ahead and pressed up my hem to the wrong side by 1.5 inches, and I'll pin in place all the way around. Edge stitch along the raw edge to secure the hem in place. Now I'll turn my sleeve right side out and place it right sides together with its corresponding armhole, aligning the underarm seams, the dots, and the notches, and pinning in place. We're going to sew this armhole seam twice, first with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, then once again with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then to reduce bulk in the underarm area, we're going to trim the seam allowance from front notch to back notch, just trimming along that second row of stitching. Here is the lower edge of my bodice. For each of the facings, we're going to turn them along their seam to the right side and pin in place, repeating for the bottoms of both facings. Sew horizontally along both of these center front areas with a 1.25 inch seam allowance. Then we'll trim those bottom corners to reduce some of the bulk. Then turn these bottom corners right side out. Press the remainder of the bottom of the cardigan to the wrong side by 1.25 inches straight across. Then I'm going to stitch close to the raw edge on the inside to hem, just as I did for the bottoms of the sleeves, sewing from center front straight across to the opposite center front. Then we'll top stitch with our 1 inch seam allowance along both sides of the center front once again, this time with a regular stitch length, and stitching all the way to the bottom edge. Using your buttonhole guide pattern piece, mark the button placement along the right front and sew each buttonhole in place. Then sew each of your buttons in place on the left side across from each buttonhole. Now the cardigan is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss upcoming sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.